Good afternoon and welcome everyone to this October 10th work session of the County Board. Subject matter today is going to be the Commercial Market Resiliency Initiative, otherwise known as CMRI 2.0. Before we get into that, a couple of disclosures. First, today participating here in the room, Board Chair Christian Dorsey presiding, joined by board members Matt DeFerranti and Tanya Talento. Participating virtually for personal reasons are Vice Chair Libby Garvey and Board Member Takis Karantonis. And I should also note before we begin our work session this afternoon, we convene under the specter of escalating violence and war in the Middle East. And we know that that is something that personally affects many in this community. And while this is not the time or the forum to get into a deeper discussion on factors that are concerning the Middle East, we can say unequivocally that we condemn all of the violence that has been targeted at non-combatants and civilians that has caused many to be kidnapped and many to be murdered. And we hope that the violence de-escalates quickly without further loss of significant life to the civilian populations there. That's all I'm prepared to say at this point. And fortunately, there's no great segue to talking about our subject matter today, but we are convened to talk about the Commercial Market Resiliency Initiative. And, you know, we do so with concerning data points, which look at very elevated and high rates of office vacancy in our community as well as in the region. And that is enough to merit our attention. But we convene today with a sense of urgency because this is a little bit different than some of the elevated rates of vacancy that we've experienced in the past. It's, I think, safe to say that previously those were the result of significant shocks to the system where we had disinvestment in office space in Arlington County, folks moving out, expiring leases, and in many cases the path forward was just simply to backfill that space and find new occupants for it. And we were successful. We had a lot of great successes over the mid-2000s with Nestle and with Boeing bringing their corporate headquarters here, and RTX, formerly known as Raytheon, deciding to have their corporate presence here, and of course Amazon. But this is a little bit different because this is in the midst of a paradigm shift in the commercial market. We've got remote work, which is a thing that wasn't really a thing before. There's increased competition within our region, but not only within the region, around the country, as people can figure out how to have employees work from anywhere. They can have satellite offices located anywhere, and the demand for space in places that are like Arlington are much more dispersed. And then, of course, there's a market which is incredibly in turmoil with incredibly low valuations in commercial space, which impacts lending and trading, and significant flexibility in folks leasing up space. And what served us well for generations in Arlington has really been upended. And so our challenge is to adapt to this new environment while leveraging all the things that make Arlington great. Great placemaking, which has been the hallmark of Arlington, will continue to be our way forward to attracting people to fill what space exists and what space will be created. And then, of course, our infrastructure, which is best in class in our tremendous neighborhoods that are suitable for raising families and settling in and setting down roots, will all serve us well. But this is a conversation about how we adapt and what our staff has proposed for us to consider in the weeks and months ahead. So with that, I will turn it over to our manager.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the board. I'm going to echo a lot of the things that you just said, Mr. Dorsey, and we are here to talk about commercial market resiliency. This is an effort that's already been underway for the past couple of years. And we're looking at, as you said, how to deal with the external changes and the shifting trends and what's going on in the commercial market and office space. And, you know, we all here, and those of us who work for the county and people who work everywhere else, the way we do our work has changed, I think, permanently. And the effects and the vacancies that we face are fundamentally affecting the amount of revenue we collect and how we fund our core government programs. Having done this, we're talking about CMRI 2.0. We're wrapping up 1.0. I want to be very clear, this is not about changing the foundation of how we operate in Arlington. This is about examining some regulations and practices and processes to see how we can do a better job at repositioning some of our commercial buildings. We talked a little bit about what was going on in the first phase of the initiative, where we enabled urban agriculture, research and development, micro-fulfillment centers in some of our buildings. And so today we're going to ask your support as we lay out a path for beginning the second phase of work. And core to that will be community engagement, remaining a critical part of the conversation. There are going to be some things in here that we haven't talked about in a long time, and some new ideas that I think necessarily will raise questions and perhaps make a few people anxious, but this is all going to be part of what we do in the context of our normal engagement. And we're going to be spending a lot of time doing that. So without further ado, what I'm going to do is hand it off to Ryan Toohill to start us, and then you will be hearing from Jill Hunger, Mark McCauley, Anthony Fusarelli, and perhaps I will chime in at times. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Ryan.
Out of batteries.
You're on.
Thanks. Thank you. Good evening. Thank you, Mark. Before we dive into the presentation, I just want to take a moment to thank Jill and Mark, who are here with us tonight, who are going to be doing the most of the presenting. They've been our co-leads from AED and CPHD on this project, and behind them is a number of other members from other county departments. So we really appreciate their work. The way we're going to structure this is we have 3 sections of the presentation. I'm going to give a quick overview and kind of set the scene, and then hand it over to Mark and Jill. And after each of those sections, we have a time to pause for some more robust Q&A. Obviously, board members can ask questions along the way, but we thought we'd just pause at each of these sections so we can make sure we not only answer your questions, but capture any ideas that you might have.
Great.
So with that, we'll jump into the presentation. And we can just go on to slide 3, I guess.
We're having a little technical difficulty. I will try to bring it up on my computer. Okay.
Okay, thanks. So you might recall seeing this, some of you have seen this slide before. We actually brought this to you in our budget work session earlier this year. And we really want to start by recognizing that the demand of hybrid work has created a real wholesale shift in how the office market is being used, both here in Arlington and nationally. And because of the continuation of remote work, more companies are letting leases expire, and the downsizing of their office footprints continues to be a trend. And in addition, we're seeing companies really seek more high-quality office buildings versus more of the older buildings that we have here in Arlington. And so we're seeing kind of an oversupply of an aging office buildings in our market. And so this combination of supply and oversupply of office and low demand has really created a scenario where we're thinking we're going to see structural vacancy for a number of years. Arlington's not alone in this, as everyone probably realizes. I mean, many communities regionally and nationally are dealing with this issue. And so we're trying to respond to the changing conditions and the challenges in the market by putting forward creative ideas and programs that'll drive economic growth. Perhaps what sets us apart from other communities is, as Mark mentioned, this work has already begun by implementing initiatives that seek to drive new demand for office and more quickly respond to shifts in the office market. And so tonight we're really focused on sharing some new bold ideas with you so we can support the repositioning of our office market. And we believe these recommendations are both timely and necessary if we want to stabilize not only the market, but better capture future economic growth. So some of the trends that we're continuing to see in the office market is return to office, that is people going back into their office buildings, continues to hover around 47% in the DC region. And that tracks nationally with what we're seeing across the nation. In terms of leasing, we're continuing to see contraction, consolidation, and terminations of leases, and that's resulted, at least regionally, in net negative absorption. And so these are the factors that are really driving vacancy to historic levels. But what's perhaps more of a challenge is the impact all of this is having on office valuations. And combined with the vacancy, we're also seeing challenges in our capital markets that are leading to more complicated scenarios and challenges when it comes to refinancing of loans. And we're seeing some defaults both here and in the region. And we're also seeing buildings trade, or that is sell, at much lower values than they were previously assessed at. And so this is the kind of vacancy plus the issue of valuations is what's really concerning us in terms of destabilizing the market. So we'll go to the next slide. And so to give you some context on how big this challenge is, our vacancy rate currently is 21.5%, which means about 9 million square feet of office is vacant on the market today. Now, while vacancy is kind of, as you can see from the chart, been between 20 and 22% since about the first quarter of 2021, we do anticipate that this number could rise as we know that there's some leases coming up in the future. And so to better kind of understand the impact that and frankly our exposure, AED conducted a full analysis of our office market. So we looked at all 328 buildings earlier this year, and using a mixture of quantitative and qualitative measures, we determined that about 76 of those 328 businesses were at risk for sustained vacancy or obsolescence. So to put that in perspective, those 76 buildings represent about 17 million square feet of our market. So what we're really this is why we think it's really necessary for our market to now shift and evolve to meet kind of current demands, to limit our exposure as a community to decreased office values and sustained vacancy. So if we go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about why this all matters to our community. So as I said previously, the exposure and impact to the county's commercial tax base is something that is real and could be a potential challenge for many years, and especially as it relates to generating revenue to fund essential services. Historically, we've had that 50-50 split between our commercial and residential tax base. But in recent years, we've seen that increase from to more of a 55-45 split. And this means that our residents are carrying more of the burden to fund our essential services. And it's important to note that these challenges in the office market should not be just a concern for commercial property owners or developers. It's really a concern for the whole community, because the revenue from the commercial property taxes plays an important role in funding our budget annually. And if these revenues decrease, then services and programs that benefit all of our residents, businesses, and those who visit Arlington could be impacted. So let's talk briefly about what we've kind of been focused on. So in our next slide, we see what we've really been trying to talk about here is when we talk about our response or our solution set, is how do we drive more demand to our business districts and offices, and how do we rethink and address the oversupply of office. So as Mark mentioned, we've taken numerous steps already, and the board has approved numerous initiatives and programs that have helped drive demand. That includes CMRI 1.0 by passing numerous new uses that have allowed us to bring and will allow us to bring new businesses to the county. We're continuing to work on attraction, retention, and expansion at AED. We've updated our permit system. We've focused on outdoor dining, and we've given tremendous support to our small and neighborhood serving businesses. And while these efforts will continue, we really want to focus with CMRI 2.0 on how do we address the oversupply of office. So in the next slide, this gives you kind of a sense of where we're targeting. And really, the goal here is pretty straightforward. It's to reduce regulatory barriers to achieve market solutions faster. And we want to do that by focusing mainly on three core areas: redevelopment of office buildings, conversion of office buildings, and the repositioning of office buildings. And so we think that it's an important time to look at our policies and our regulations and determine if we can make changes to help accelerate some of these market solutions in an effort to reposition the market. So with that kind of context setting, I'll pause there and we can address any questions before we move on to some of the details of CMRI 2.0.
All right, any questions, comments about where we are? And since we can't really see you, I will give first opportunity for our hybrid participants, Mr. Karantonis or Ms. Garvey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Garvey is fine,
I-
thank you.
Okay,
Go ahead, Marcus.
Mr. Karantonis.
And I'm mostly fine as well. First of all, Mr. Chair, thank you for mentioning the terrible events that we all have seen in the news this past weekend. I know that it affects a lot of actually a lot of Arlington families here who have people, relatives, friends, colleagues who are in Israel, and they have been affected. So, but I wanted to ask one thing. It was mentioned that out of 328 buildings, 76 are, at risk. Let's say, could be potentially at risk. So, are all these buildings, kind of Class B office space? Do we have an idea of how they're where they are in the desirability scala for investment?
Got it, thank you.
Yeah, so most of the buildings are older office buildings, and as Mr. Karantonis mentioned, in the kind of the Class B, Class C category. What we're seeing in Arlington and across the region is that trophy and Class A office buildings continue to perform well, which is good because Arlington has a lot of that type of space. So these are really kind of the older buildings that don't have the floor plates similar to new office buildings, core amenities, things of that nature, which we're really seeing tenants drive towards.
And I guess there is not enough desire or incentive to upgrade these buildings or to renovate, etc., so that they are organically not desirable.
There are some that could be repositioned for sure, or converted or renovated. We haven't. What we wanted to do with this analysis was just identify those that could have exposure. So as we continue to work through these work streams, we know kind of which buildings and which owners to reach out to. So just because they were kind of categorized as at risk doesn't mean they're completely obsolete and that we can't do anything with them. It actually just means more of like those should be our early targets in terms of potentially applying new regulation, any new regulations and policies towards those buildings, if that makes sense.
Yeah, testing tools. Yes, it does. Thank you. I yield.
Thank you. And as you mentioned, Director Tuhill, the turmoil in the credit, the capital markets impact the ability for anyone who may want to reposition to be able to do so in a timely fashion.
Yeah. And Mr. McCauley can certainly speak to more of that, but yes, we're seeing a lot of that right now. It's a very tight capital market, and as a result, those things for TIs and tenant improvements and other things, money for that is harder to come by right now.
Okay, Mr. DeFerranti.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I really appreciate the framing remarks of all three of you. I want to pay particular thanks for, and just a thought on slide 3, structural office vacancy, the potential for a structural office vacancy. that seems honest and to reveal the challenge we face. I think our structurally, economically, over the medium to long term, I feel confident, but that doesn't mean the short to medium term, there aren't office vacancy structural problems, and I think there's a distinction if you think about the growth in each of our different geographic sectors. So just to thank you for that on slide 3. The 76 buildings and the specificity there, I also appreciate, and really being, putting quite clearly the challenge of our vacancy rate. I don't know, I've sort of scanned, but the question I would have is there any context that won't be covered in later slides on our vacancy rate as you compare it with Fairfax's and DC's? Because, or Prince William, we have such a higher percentage of office, and so I don't need that question answered now. I just thought I'd raise it because I think the graph leads us to it. But if it's in the later sections, you can punt till later.
It's not, and what we'll say is that we're, yeah, thank you, Mark. We actually, I think, Mark shared some information on this with you earlier today. Right now, I mean, we're currently leading the market at 21.5%, but we've seen other jurisdictions surrounding us begin to increase in terms of vacancy as it relates to DC and Fairfax and some of the others closer in. So we kind of anticipate that trend to continue.
Got it. And
In
then,
this case, leading the market is not good.
yes, and it's just to confirm for those viewing and those with an interest, Fairfax and Prince William have a much smaller, very much, as to my understanding, not, growing and changing in both cases, but much smaller percentage of their total buildings that are office, so they might have lower vacancy rates as a result. Is that a fair? Okay, thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Okay, I think you can continue.
Okay, we're going to turn it over to Jill, who is going to walk us through all the principles that we've thought out that clearly undergird all of this, and I'm sure will be unassailable.
Challenge accepted.
Great. Thank you very much. Just taking a step back, and wanted to remind everybody where we were. This was back in April of 2022, really unveiling the Commercial Market Resiliency Initiative 1.0, so we were referring to it. And this was a slide that we presented to you previously, and what we did is really focused on those first 3 elements. Looking at new uses in commercial buildings, a process to consider new uses and types of entitlements, like how do we do those things? And really what this was doing was focusing on that initial part of the office demand side. But we always recognized we might have a need for other process changes. So next slide, please. So going into now, what we're doing is this Commercial Market Resiliency Initiative 2.0, really focusing now on that buildings of the office supply that Ryan was able to speak to. So the CMRI 2.0 is intended to tackle the big regulatory issues that result in big changes, apropos of the challenge of this structural change of the commercial market. So again, reminding everybody where we were and what we've accomplished. This is not going away. These are some new uses that we have put into our zoning ordinance that can be in our commercial and mixed-use districts, ranging from micro-fulfillment centers to colleges and universities, certain types of indoor recreation, the audio-visual, production and broadcast studios, and the like. But now what we're going to see is this greater focus on major process changes in how do we really move the needle in looking at that building supply. We'll get into a little bit more of the strategic goals in the next slide. So as Ryan alluded to, some of the big things that we're trying to achieve are found in these strategic goals, really to improve our redevelopment processes. Again, what we're trying to do is how do we best remove some of the obsolete office inventory. There's a lot of sites that are guided by existing plans, and how do we more nimbly and have a less costly approach to that redevelopment? How do we streamline our processes for building repositioning? in those functioning buildings that we want to keep there. How do they have new investments in a highly competitive market? Can we create a new process for adaptive reuse and conversions? Again, as Ryan pointed out, that this might be a smaller opportunity that we have, but we are starting to hear some more inquiries from property owners and developers. 4, how do we address regulatory relief tools, primarily for our tenants? As we're trying to attract tenants, how can we make it easier for them to open their doors for business? And finally, enhancing our placemaking efforts. Our next slide will go into the guiding principles. So with this, we sort of have 2 cornerstones of taking big swings and community education, but we're layering over a lens of a sense of urgency. And with that in mind, we're going to be having a tactical approach to our staff work and discrete work streams, which we'll be talking about sort of in this next section. And the whole concept of this is to come forward to our county board with these incremental outcomes. It's an incremental approach that we're proposing. Next slide. And with all of this in mind, I think our manager alluded to this, is that we're going to continue to have an engagement approach associated with this. So we did have some streamlined approaches to engagement for changes that had limited impact. The graphic itself indicates sort of the process that we used for the CMRI 1.0, that we had a request to advertise that went to the county board as part of a public hearing. We did targeted engagement in discussions with our zoning committee and online information and comment forms. And then we went to the ordinance amendment itself with both our planning commission public hearings and our county board public hearings, sort of as a way to move the needle and look at these different types of uses. We're going to continue that and add sort of this public education about our commercial and real estate issues and their impacts onto our community. We're going to make certain that we have appropriate levels of community engagement for each of our work stream, really looking at an adherence to our 6-step guide to engagement. But we will have that focus on nimbleness, urgency, and suitable risk-taking. And finally, having opportunities for innovative engagement strategies. So with that, I would like to open it up to any questions or comments about these guiding principles, the strategic goals, and then also our strategy.
Thank you. Seeing none in the room, Mr. Karantonis, Ms. Garvey? Nothing there.
Just a little, Mr. Chair, if
Yes,
I may.
please.
Thank you so much. I really agree with the framing of the initial vectors of action here. I want to ask one thing. There is a constituency that's important as well, which is the people who actually work in this market, the commercial agents, the companies that our tenants, etc. I assume that they will be part of the many constituents that we will be reaching out with as we work through these goals, right?
Yes, we are, I think, scheduled to be on the agenda. I think it is tomorrow morning? For NAOP. Which NAOP, which stands for the National Association of Industrial and Office Properties. And we will be reaching out to the Chamber of Commerce. We'll be reaching out to developers in the community. This is in addition to the people who are actually living in these places that will be covered by our 6 stages of public engagement. So the answer is yes.
Thank you.
Ms. Garvey?
Yeah, thank you. Just wanted to say, I really appreciate everything in the presentation so far, the analysis that's being done, the way it's being structured and explained, and obviously I think the community engagement is really important, including with the local stakeholders and the business folks, because it's such a change situation. You're making it really explicit, and I think we do need to continue to talk about it and help people kind of make that shift, because if you've been busy with other things in your lives and not paid a lot of attention to it, you might not have noticed the huge change, and even some of the things kind of surprised me. So really appreciate all of this communication effort. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Talento.
I just want to echo Ms. Garvey's thanks on the work that you've done so far and what you've provided us today at this point in the presentation. I do have a question about timeline. On page 15, you talk about the engagement. All of that makes sense. I'm just curious, with the first one, you showed the CMRI 1.0 engagement approach. Do you have like a timeline, how long it'll take for this one to get to the point of the county board public hearing or the ordinance amendment? Sorry.
Sure. So at this point in time, we're sort of in this due diligence mode. So staff, and I think we'll get to a little bit more conversation about the work streams and individual work streams in this next section that will be presented. But we're in that process right now. As we're sort of working through those and fleshing them out, I think with those, we'll come up with timelines. And each of those individual work streams will have their own engagement strategy. Some may have a larger impact, which would require a different engagement strategy than something that might not have or have a very limited impact. So again, we'd be applying that 6-step engagement process that we have, but it would be per each work stream itself.
And are the work streams based on this like redevelopment, conversion, repositioning?
Broadly, they're really based around those strategic goals.
Okay.
And you'll see them in sort of how they lay out in the next
Got it. So
section.
just depending on what the tools are that are developed from the due diligence community engagement.
Yes.
And what it takes to adopt those or streamline them or understanding where the community is going to approve, support them or not, or be more innovative.
Exactly.
That will determine the timeline for each one. So this is a living process per se.
Exactly, yes.
Okay, very
Incremental
helpful.
approach.
I like that. Okay, thank you. That's helpful.
If I could add, and did you have a question? Because that's a great segue into the next section.
Let's do it.
I think, Ms. Talento, I appreciate that question. We are not about to unveil very specific proposals that we will be bringing to the board for action at the October board meeting on Saturday. The first one of these, and the easier of some of these, you may see starting in, I'm not sure you will personally see it, but we'll see starting in January. We have in mind that there's some big swings here and some smaller items, and we wanted to get your sort of head nod and approval that we're headed in the right direction. But we do not, believe it or not, staff is aware of the fact there will be 2 new board members starting in January. There's a lot of conversation that has to happen in the community, but there's a lot of hard conversations that we need to start right now. So that's what we're going to do. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. McCauley to start us on some of the specifics of what we talked about. And again, I want to highlight, these are specifics, but with no actual specific recommendations.
Thank you. So this is an overview slide, and both Ms. Hunger and Mr. Fucirelli are also going to speak to some specifics of some of these work streams. And we'll focus on what we think are the bigger work stream challenges or opportunities. But just as you see, this initiative is really made up of a kit of parts of different work streams, some of which are already ongoing, some of which will be enhanced, some of which are new. So while we won't talk about things like some of the placemaking elements, like the special events or culture, work with the bids, or the food study, you've been briefed on those before and understand that those are ongoing efforts to continue to work with our partnerships with the bids and the partnerships and continue to evolve the future of outdoor dining. A lot of these also is very important to note that they, as you can see, they sort of relate to different outcomes per Ms. Talento's comment of some of these cross paths with each other. So the staff work is going to be significantly collaborative, although there'll be discrete work streams. The role of Ms. Hunger and I are to sort of make sure that these are not siloed, that they're speaking to each other, and that, as Jill had mentioned, that we'll come to you with outcomes as they sort of are resolved or are ready for board consideration. I'll also mention that this is a major initiative, so each of these work streams includes staff from across different departments and divisions who have particular expertise in this. So this is not, once again, a siloed effort. So with that said, next slide.
We were perhaps guessing that that rather than letting us get through the 7 slides, you may actually have questions on each of the slides here.
Oh, look
so.
at that. Look at that.
Thank you, Mr. McCauley, to sort of lay out everything. And I think what we'll do is walk through each of these major work streams and pause for any of guidance and factors that you wish us to consider. Really talking about sort of this one big item is the administrative change, minor and major site plan amendments. Currently, it's found in our zoning ordinance, and among other criteria, a change in use or additional densities greater than 5% of the total building GFA, or even an increased building height of more than 12 feet requires a major site plan amendment. And then further, any modification of a site plan that is not considered a major amendment and can't be approved administratively is a minor amendment. So as we're doing our due diligence, we're asking some questions about, how should we look at this? What types of criteria? And weighing in what are the challenges that we are currently facing with respect to timing, with respect to costs, and staff resources. So I think a couple of examples of looking at what's occurred with the county board lately is really understanding a major site plan amendment for the loft building at the crossing at Clarendon that allowed for retail or office use on the 3rd floor instead of just exclusively office use. You've also seen a couple of minor site plan amendments that have come forward to you for maybe less than 200 square feet of density exclusions or additional GFA to accommodate a repositioning of a building. And also, improving an amenity deck and updating landscaping. So looking at these and what's the best way to help reposition our buildings, help tenant attraction and retention efforts. So again, some of the potential outcomes of this potential, again, we're doing our due diligence, is maybe how do we look at and how do we define the standards for a major site plan amendment and provide some additional guidance of what is an administrative change versus a minor site plan amendment. I'm going to pause right there to see if you have any thoughts, any questions around this.
Thank you. I'll begin. Certainly major and minor being subjective terms are often in the eye of the beholder. And as you mentioned, Ms. Hunger, what's meant by staff in that regard is probably often different than what the community feels. Staff looks at it from how much work do we have to do to consider this? And the community's like, what kind of an impact is this going to have on me? And without clarity in those subjective terms, or maybe that's just an area that we can explore, how to bring some clarity to those subjective terms. But I also think more to the point, the objective criteria that's in the zoning ordinance about, square footage percentages, for example, doesn't exactly scratch the itch. You can have a significant change in GFA, but if it doesn't come with a change of use, I would submit that many people in the community wouldn't see it as a major big deal. So I see this as a ripe area of work. And for me, thinking as a member of the community, when something that is approved does change in use from office to residential, I could see the need for there to be a larger review. And certainly if it affects any site plan conditions, particularly ones that were a part of the community engagement process, those to me are major regardless of any objective criteria that may or may not be met. So if we could do some work to better clarify that so that we could, certainly not disappoint people with how things are designated, because they often believe that that's something that we do on an ad hoc basis with no criteria at all. That would be helpful. And then 2, if we could figure out how that also does not add to the staff workload so that all of a sudden everything becomes major, which I know is something that a few people in our community would love to see, but I do not think should be a goal of this effort. Mr. DeFerranti.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to, I think your a major site plan, if you're nearby, or minor, if you live right there, is you have a different perspective than if you live in a different part of the county. But with that point, I just full support for exploring this. I do think we need to get to objective criteria that we can substantiate, but I'm fully supportive of pursuing this line. I think it has to be part of our work as we look at a changed paradigm. So thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Karantonis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I fully agree with you, Mr. Chair, on discussing this item from a point of view of having a qualitative approach to what major and minor means, and how the appreciation of the impact and being very clear about what impacts every amendment proposal brings. But I want to say that I've seen a lot of major amendments that would have been, let's call them not minor, but less major, if transparency in the process would be somehow codified in the process, so that everybody around the table, including the public stakeholders, including the neighborhood, the immediate impacted parties, etc., understand why an applicant asks for something, what do they try to accomplish here, and what are the benefits and what are the potential downsides of the proposal. If we have a process that is just a little bit more transparent and accessible, I think we will be making a lot of progress towards something that will allow us to have a more balanced conversation about what major and minor is. I hear very often, and this also, it's not only big companies or big stakeholders, but specifically smaller businesses who despair sometimes with the complication of the major process, the major amendment process.
Thank you. Okay.
I did want to add one thing here, because I was thinking about this earlier today. For, a lot of people in the community, if they heard that a developer had to spend all this money to come to the county board to get 20 square feet of a parking garage that used to park 2 cars to put a fence around it, they'd go, "You bureaucrats, you're driving us crazy." And that actually may have been a major site plan amendment. The flip side of that is that if we have some commercial space that someone comes in and they want to make it retail, and you're living across the street from that, that you may not think that's minor. So we have to be really clear about that. And the other thing, since we haven't told you what the objective criteria will be, this is not probably going to be one of the ones that's going to come to you right out of the gate. So I think this is one of the more difficult ones. And the other thing I did want to say is we do have a lot of information, but we need to do a better job of telling the community what we do administratively. So in other words, presenting information to the public, whether it's in the board meetings, saying, okay, well, this week we did this administratively, and these are things that, staff is smart, but sometimes we miss the mark. These things that weren't all that important, and then we can calibrate as we do that if we're going to have more administrative discussion and hear back from you in the community. So that's just a little bit of a gloss on some of the conversation. So
Thank you. And before we move on, I see Ms. Garvey's hand.
No, I just wanted to say I'm very supportive of this effort, and the challenge of government is to be nimble. I mean, that we've got to be nimble, and it's really hard for government to do that. I know the devil's going to be in the details, as we say, with these standards, and I'm looking forward to the work and really appreciate the effort because it's important. We got to do it. But I don't know any of us should fool ourselves. It's not going to be easy, but I'm glad we're undertaking it. Thank you.
All right. Next bucket.
So I'll speak to this slide. I'm sure as the board and everyone else in the community is well aware, everyone is asking the question of, well, why don't we just convert the office to some other use? And we've looked at that issue and studied it pretty closely. We released a white paper last year that sort of addressed some of those issues, and we're going to reframe that and continue to think about that. There certainly are some challenges to office conversions. For most buildings, the conversion to a different use, particularly residential, is just not possible. There's issues with floor plate sizes, ceiling heights, the useful life of the building, and we also have tremendous plans in our community that allow for redevelopment, which is often a preferred option. With that said, while we think there's probably less than 10 buildings in the county that really are really eligible. As Jill said, we are seeing significant increased interest by developers looking at conversions, whether it be full conversions or partial conversions, meaning, keeping the parking garage, but building a new superstructure above it. And while it may not be a major mover in terms of square footage, it still is an important thing to study and study soon. This is, even if it's just for the value of, even if there's only one or two of these, we don't want our regulations to be in the way of these opportunities. We do have a limited amount of past examples in Arlington. The WeWork, We Live building, the old WeWork, We Live building, that converted office space into micro units. And then 220 20th, also in the National Landing neighborhood, which now more than probably a decade ago, Anthony, essentially gutted the building, added some stories into a Class A residential building. But we do expect to hopefully see some more. And what we've learned from other jurisdictions is, while this is not a proposed solution yet, we have to study it, is that the ease of process has allowed for other jurisdictions to capture some of these opportunities. So Alexandria to the south, Fairfax has had some significant movement in conversions, and their processes have not been wholly administrative in some cases, but have allowed for a more streamlined process. And so what we're going to study for this work stream is how to streamline that process, including administrative path, but administrative path may be a part of the path, not all of the path. That solving the conversions plus, which is just a way of saying when, like 220 20th, when someone wants to sort of add a couple of stories, how do we provide that GFA in a streamlined way? Mark's favorite term, conversions plus. I'm sticking to it. And then green building incentives. And I think you saw in one of the work streams, we talked about green building in CMRI. And this is a concept we're working with our DAS partners, and they're already been very much underway in this effort, is typically we think about our green building as new construction and providing enhanced systems and bird-friendly glass and all those other things that are important. But when it's a conversion, those may not be as possible to maximize the systems in the building or other aspects of the building. But there is a concept of embedded carbon, which is that conversions do provide an opportunity relative to climate change impact on not spending that energy to tear down a building, which is a pretty significant part of the climate change impacts of new construction. So with that said, I will once again stop and happy to hear your comments and guidance.
Mr. Chair.
Sorry, please. Trying to multitask and not doing it well. Mr. DeFerranti.
No problem, Mr. Chair. Mr. McCauley, your comments seemed right on. I think of how I've lived the experience of thinking about conversions over the last 2 years, and I just, at least from my part, and if you strongly disagree, feel free to correct me, but the Washington Post had a lead editorial the Sunday before last that started with our broad point that, this is not going to be the elixir that fixes this challenge, but we still need to be opportunistic. And so I wanted to see if you agree with that sort of framing. And then also, you mentioned a couple of the reasons, most people, when they think of office to residential, they say they're like, the space is there, no problem. And, if the height of the ceiling is too low, let the market work that out. But at least for me, the way that our plumbing in almost all office buildings of this type works, it's hard for people, to think of a full floor and, fundamentally you don't have a bathroom. And so not to be too concrete, but that is my sense of why, in addition to the other reasons, office to residential doesn't usually actually work, because then it gets quite expensive to run lines out from the central line for water and your bathroom. So the post, does it sort of frame things in a good way as to this is not the typical solution for everything, and then also the plumbing and bathroom question?
Yeah, that's a great point, and I'm glad you mentioned it, because that's also, that's why the cost of converting is not as low as some people may think it is. It's not just a new coat of paint and putting in some walls. You have to do the plumbing, you have to do the system. Systems work differently in a residential building where you have individual metering typically, and versus like an office floor where you need to change the windows because people like to open the windows. In an office building, you don't open your windows. So there's a lot of those issues. And so it's the cost of converting can be less than new development in certain areas, particularly with saving of parking, if you're able to save the parking. But in terms of the actual fit out, it's actually what we've heard from developers and have seen is it's not that. It's almost as expensive, if not more expensive, to convert. And I'll also say that the one thing that we'll continue to talk about is, we talked about the 9 million square feet of vacant space. We don't have the ability to absorb 4 million square feet of residential space in the next several years. So it's not only not an elixir because of the challenges of conversion, but even if every building could be converted, the market would be saturated with residential, and there wouldn't be a demand for it, given that how much vacant office space we have.
Ms. Talento.
Thank you. I just want to follow up a little bit on what Mr. DeFranti was sharing. So all that makes sense. The conversions are not easy. They're not necessarily ideal the way that people may envision. But what I just want to confirm that what I'm hearing y'all say is what we're seeing right now is that, and I'm assuming this is due to higher construction costs, supply chain issues in the construction and build world, municipalities moving towards more friendly climate building and efforts, that it's no longer as cost effective as it used to be to tear down and build from scratch, et cetera. And so there are now newer opportunities today based on the regional vacancy rate that's happening probably nationally, but at least regionally, that we are now saying, for the few places where people are interested in asking about, what can we do to streamline that process? And that's what you're going to explore with this particular section.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
And I'll also mention that that one of the factors, unfortunately, that we are seeing that is pushing towards more conversion is our office buildings are worth less than they were. So you can buy them cheaper, and then that changes the cost factor as well. But absolutely, the whole goal of this process is to identify a clear process when someone comes to the county and says, I want to convert this, that there's a path from A to Z, and that it's as efficient as possible given the often wire-thin margins that those buildings have, that we need to make sure that we're not creating additional cost or timing that impacts those decisions.
So when you all are doing community engagement on this, will you be working primarily with developers on what, can you tell me a little bit about because I don't know if our everyday residents will really look at this besides the whole factor of how it'll impact their life if you're putting in new use, right? But I was just curious, what kind of engagement will be for the office conversions discussions as you go out to the community?
So certainly, I think with respect to that question, and I think Ms. Hunger hit on this a little earlier, is that for a lot of the work that the work streams will be progressing forward, we fully anticipate in right-sizing the community engagement and on the various topic areas. And so for this particular instance, I would imagine we would certainly want direct engagement with those in the industry to understand what would make the biggest difference or what could make the biggest difference from a process and approval perspective. But I think we would also want, and potentially falling within the other workstream conversation just a few moments ago on what constitutes a major versus minor versus admin change, we would expect, engagement with the community as well to get their input so that we're getting all perspectives, I think, on, each of these work streams, if not all of them, going forward.
And this, thank you for stating that again, because this reminds me that I think one of you said, these are all overlapping, so you can't just take them in silos. So while you're going out there in these different work streams, it's really thinking about it holistically on how these changes may complement each other or interfere with each other and where the compromises are. Is that correct?
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you. Ms. Garvey.
Yeah, thank you. This is all helpful. I find myself wondering, I know we said a few office buildings have been sold at 60% of their vacant, 60% of their assessed value. And we've got three different ways that we're looking at conversions, and we're looking at redevelopment and at repositioning. So I think there are three kind of major streams. Do we have a sense, is there a pattern as to what in Arlington is going to be of most interest? Is there a pattern in the region? And then I'm assuming it may, maybe depend on what we do here, may influence decisions on what makes sense for people to do. But I'm just wondering, and you may not be able to answer this, I know it's just sort of a larger question, but I found myself wondering, is there kind of a pattern as to what direction most of the buildings, at least in Arlington, are, what they might be inclined to do?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think the predominant path, given our very thoughtful long-range planning for most of our neighborhoods, has been redevelopment. When we've seen neighborhoods that needed to be reinvested in, we provided the tools for developers to take older buildings out of service and build new buildings. So that's been, I think that has been the trend and will continue to be the trend. Prior to the capital markets going a little bit off track, we were seeing significant interest in repositioning and reinvestment in buildings that were well located and had a strong useful life. And then again, conversions is probably the least active of it, but still something very important for us to solve.
Thank you.
Mr. Karantonis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just two footnotes. I am thinking very often about conversions and what the upsides and downsides are. And I align myself with all my colleagues here. I want to just contribute to two thoughts. One is, it's not very long time ago that in Arlington it was almost impossible to find, for small businesses, for startups, for really good tenants who produce a lot of good jobs, to find office space that was affordable for them, a Class C office space or Class B minus office space. So before we have a lot of investors or others jump fast into a conversion discussion or conversion project, I want to just to point out that there is value in having some lower valued office space at the end. I'm not so sure what the right market segment and market share would be, but that's to me one thing that springs to mind. The second thing is, I have the impression that when in combination with this loan to value consideration, when you talked about very tight refinancing markets, etc., that we may see, owners or operators to try to, when they have a building that is kind of persistently not sufficiently full or has a chronic vacancy, who may see them to try to consolidate tenants. So to take, for example, a tenant from one building that they own and it's only 40% occupied, to move them to another building where then, where they have some other tenants, and so have one building that functions and performs well and free up the other building. So I don't know what I think that we should have a role in trying to understand this market and and make it work. And I'm just leaving that on the table for staff to discuss that.
Yeah, it's a great point. I think we have actually seen some of that, particularly with some of our largest landlords. JBG Smith comes to mind, where they've been very creative about moving tenants into certain buildings to free up redevelopment opportunities of some of their older buildings. Obviously, it requires that you own enough real estate that you can make those decisions, and that obviously the tenant is willing to move. So yeah, absolutely. Well, that's something we're looking at as part of this process in terms of how we may incent those types of decisions in order to free up some opportunities.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right, moving us along, I'll be introducing the next two slides that pertain specifically to one of our planning processes in particular, but also past plans adopted by this board and how we might evolve our way of applying that guidance moving forward. So regarding the special general land use plan study, or special GLUP study as we often refer to it, as you know, there have been earlier and recent observations and suggestions for revisiting this process in particular, especially with an eye towards improvement. In fact, with the most recently completed special GLUP study for the 2000 block of North Glebe Road, staff took a few initial steps to really help streamline that process, and reconsider the action the board should take once we bring forward a study document forward for consideration. But while these updates have been helpful in our view, we also see additional opportunities for further enhancement to the process, and even rethinking when such studies should be conducted, and explore a few specific questions as part of this work stream that really speak to the potential work stream outcomes. And again, don't want to presuppose here this afternoon where we're going to land on this, but I think a few specific questions that we've identified early on. For example, are there instances where really having a separate and preceding special GLUP study process is or is not necessary based on the current context of our planning, but also development review processes and our regulations? Or are there circumstances or situations in where it may be more beneficial, more efficient, and just as effective in considering certain GLUP changes in the context of a site plan application and potentially rezoning, the way the county had done so up until about the 2007, 2008 timeframe? So I think that is a key and fundamental question our team will be looking at. If we do decide through exploring that question that maybe there are different circumstances, trying to identify what those criteria are, and where a study should be done concurrently or perhaps should be done in advance. Broader questions, I think, certainly, and observations we've heard from the Planning Commission in particular is, the approach, both the trade-offs with conducting special GLUP studies on a site-by-site basis, and what are those trade-offs and how do they fit into our broader planning policies and our planning vision that have been set forth over time, but continue to evolve on an ongoing basis. So that is, I think, in a snapshot where we are currently. Looking forward to progressing our work in this work stream and eventually coming back with some updated recommendations and proposals for the board's consideration.
Full support, Mr. Chair.
Full support. All right. I think this is one that probably, even though you'll have to do a fair amount of engagement on it, I'm guessing a lot of people will come to embrace whatever comes of it. All right. Next one.
Okay, so moving on and sort of zooming out from a single site scale, but looking at some of our planning processes and the outcomes of those processes more broadly. Really what this work stream is focused on is an identified need to really consider how we apply our planning guidance and other land use policies, whether that should change really based on the different context and realities we find ourselves in today and we're expecting to find ourselves in tomorrow. Many of our plans were established before the pandemic and the significant and structural changes in workplace patterns and other factors that we've experienced since then. And there are certain circumstances then that perhaps don't apply similarly this afternoon and into the future. So how we think about those fundamental contextual changes outlined in today's presentation earlier through some of the slides and their content. When might it be necessary and even appropriate to consider more flexibility in how we apply adopted plans, particularly some of our older plans that have been helpful for some time, but perhaps in some cases provide such a fine level of guidance and specificity in certain areas, particularly as it relates to land use and the structural changes we're seeing in supply and demand that we've spoken to earlier. Questions about, are there any prime office sites in the county today or into the future in the context of having adopted plans and policies that do identify certain blocks or certain sites as prime office, or do identify certain specific use mix targets for commercial or otherwise. So from a use mix perspective, that will be a question and topic we will explore. As you know, we've been bringing forward recently in the past few years to the county board a number of site plan amendments that essentially allow approved site plans to incorporate ground floor uses that are consistent with our 2015 policy. But those site plans were approved at a time where there were more constraints and specific conditions that perhaps didn't enable that. So is there a way for actually to consider all of those maybe in an omnibus action or some other strategy as opposed to continuing to bring them forward case by case to the board? And then finally, in certain situations where we may have obsolete office buildings and the expectation that those would remain, what, if any, flexibility or appetite or desire is there to consider, flexibility as it relates to building heights, potentially additional density to help really transition that property going forward. So those are some of the key questions I think I've identified in the work stream thus far. Ask Mr. McCauley if he had anything I'd missed, but otherwise would look forward to considerations and perspectives.
Nope, I think that covers it. Thanks.
Thank you. We'll start with Ms. Talento.
Thank you. I think to whatever you can make this work, I think would be great. One of the, I think, great things about Arlington is that we've had really great community engagement, and it's led to a really eccentric and unique and thriving community. But it also has created, I think, barriers for streamlining. And right now, I think we're in a crisis with our commercial market rate vacancy, and I think it's important to really focus on bringing back the balance for our taxpayers and our residents, because they are going to start continuing to carry that burden of the tax rate if we aren't able to get back to where we were. And I don't know if we ever will, but at least maintain to where we are now so it doesn't get worse. The one thing that I might consider having you all think about to add is how can you maximize community engagement or make community engagement streamlined, right? A lot of the I think piecemeal work that comes before is because we were always trying to make sure that our community was not just built without understanding what our residents who are invested and live here want. But I think there's a way to find a good balance. And we've done a lot of work with our community engagement plan that we now use. But maybe making it a streamlined process, right? Or clarifying very clear points where the community has engagement and what that will be like. Right now, there's site committees. Sorry, I was on one, but I can't remember what they're called right now.
Site Plan Review Committee.
Yeah, site plan committees, right? And then you're meeting with the civic engagement, or the civic associations, and then you might have to do some pop-ups. And so there's all these like 4, 5, 6 different ways to engage on any given site plan, depending on what it's going to be. Maybe there's a way to streamline that, so we're not losing that, and the community members don't feel like we're losing that, and they know where they can come communicate as you streamline this. So just maybe adding that as a outcome of that work stream, like how are we streamlining community engagement so we don't lose the value that our community members bring, but we're not slowing down the process or getting that feedback where I didn't know this was happening, or I didn't have a chance to talk about this use and it's impacting me. It's just something out there.
Certainly, that's quite helpful, and I think we will take that back. As far as the streamlining goes and the flexibility, trying not to repeat past instances where just by changing the envisioned use of a site from office to residential didn't entail a multi-meeting committee process to work through that, and how can we have a larger framework that we could apply in a more streamlined way is something that we'll be studying as part of this.
Right. And maybe it's something of like having a public hearing that there's a certain amount of time minimum that you have to wait before it's adopted, so people don't feel like they're rushed for engagement. I mean, it doesn't have to be what we have today, but just very, very clear, where does a community member who's going to be impacted by this in any kind of way have a place to, share those concerns without slowing down a process that is necessary to make sure we're getting back to where we need to be.
Thank you. Mr. Karantonis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Fisarelli, I'm all in agreement with everything. There is the last bullet, though. I have a question. I need to understand it a little bit better. So it says flexibility of height and density caps when results to removal of obsolete office space. So the removal of obsolete office space, I understand that we are discussing whether we convert it into a sort of a public benefit that would be rewarded or would, be compensated with some forthcoming on height and density caps. Does this refer to specific buildings or specific proposals, or is it something? Is that going to be a scanning of certain areas or certain sector plans where we will be then, introducing this instrument? What is the thinking behind that? If you can elaborate a little bit more.
Certainly, Board Member Karantonis. I will comment that I think whether it applies specifically to an individual site or more broadly, I think will be part of the work that we explore here. But I think as an example, one scenario in which this question would really pertain to is if there were a site that were identified and there were sector plan guidance that had a specific and finite building height limit. If that site were occupied by an office building today that perhaps were obsolete either today or in the future, would we consider, as from our perspective, some flexibility in going above and beyond the building height that sector area plan may have identified? And so I'm not sure if today, this afternoon, we can specifically answer the question about would we apply that sort of at a macro level more broadly, or would we determine or identify criteria in which that would apply then on a case-by-case basis. But Mr. McCauley may have more to add there.
Yeah, I think you covered it well, Anthony. I think the issue is going to be, even if on a case-by-case basis, if we find situations where the tear down of an obsolete and mostly vacant office building still doesn't pencil, and additional height and density is needed, is that a tool we would have to help resolve the problem? Again, these are just concepts, not fully scoped, and so we don't know if this will ever see the light of day. This is probably what I'd describe as one of the more, one that's going to need a lot more engagement with the community, because heights and densities are obviously a big part of our planning process. But it's just a concept through which we look at any available tools to study that could help remove obsolete supply.
Excellent. Thank you for the discussion. I'm very interested to see how this thinking progresses. I think it goes in the right direction, but I believe that we will have a lot of issues to discuss and also a lot of issues to, converse with our community. Thank you.
Thank you. And in that vein, I'm excited by this body of work, as much as I think that the previous one on club studies will maybe produce some clear agreement on problems that we're trying to solve and potential solutions. This one I see as being extremely complicated, and wish you all the best of luck. Just the notion of trying to figure out how to take a contemporary community's input into the land use planning process and all that they'll want in various plans and circumstances, and then seeking to revisit that later with changing circumstances. I mean, it's the exact context that we're kind of in now. And it's going to be rather challenging, particularly when you marry it with your work on major and minor amendments. And this is going to be sticky. But if anyone's up to it, I know under the leadership of Mr. Fusarelli, we'll be able to get there.
He'll be as gray as I am by the end of this process.
All right. Ms. Garvey, is that a hand? I can't quite tell.
No, I was just applauding
all
the
right,
general
got it.
discussion. It's just fine. Thank you. I'm good.
All right, thank you. All right, I think we are ready to move on.
So this next one, for those of us that were around more than a decade ago, remember the significant process of amending our zoning ordinance, the Article 13 that deals with signs. And the result of that process was creating a primarily administrative path to sign approvals and removing that legislative decision from the county board, which before that, every building had its own what we call comprehensive site plan, sign plan, and the board approved that along with the site plan. This was obviously an effort to create greater certainty and clarity around the process for our property owners. But it also has, as we've learned, created inflexibility. The zoning administrator and her team do not have the ability to divert from what's on the written page. And sometimes, as with anything in life, you find anomalies that were unintended that create some significant disruption. Also, from an economic development perspective, signs are a major game changer in terms of how we attract tenants and how we retain them. Not saying that we envision Arlington being Times Square, but we do think some greater flexibility would help us provide non-financial incentives to tenants coming into the marketplace, which is always our goal. And we have several examples just to give you some flavor of examples of where the sign ordinance, as written, provided some challenges to tenant attraction or building development. One is a building under construction in Roslyn, a hotel, and our sign ordinance defines rooftop signs as above 40 feet. The sign above the lobby was at 48 feet and therefore was not allowed. And that was obviously not the intent of the rooftop sign ordinance. Another was when Microsoft moved into Roslyn, their building has a retaining wall, which when you walk by it looks very much like part of the plaza in the building. But under the current rules, it's considered a monument sign, and we do not allow monument signs. Obviously, we do not allow monument signs because the concept of monument sign is a sign in the middle of a street or sidewalk, or not street, sidewalk or a plaza. And we would prefer those be on buildings. But this was another nuance where we really had a difficult time sort of getting around that challenge. So what we really think is potential outcomes, again, not having fully scoped this out, is at least looking at how we can deal with some of these issues and perhaps give the board back a little bit of flexibility in how they can resolve some of these things. I can tell you that the first step in this process is not going to be scope out how we would completely rewrite Article 13. That may be a longer term issue, but that would take a significant amount of time. So a potential path would be giving the board, as I said, the ability to resolve these issues that, from a common sense standpoint, do not reflect the intent of what's written in the administrative regulations. So that could be placement and size of signs above 40 feet, large media screens. So we've had one property owner in Pentagon City who wants to recreate what they've done in Mosaic, which is a large media screen that can really be a placemaking element. And as of today, you can't do that, both in terms of it can't be placed there and it can't have commercial speech. So we'll have to work with the county attorney office on understanding that issue. And then, as I mentioned, monument signs relative to, particularly in Roslyn, because Roslyn is obviously, as we know, has a lot of grade, has a lot of retaining walls that really perhaps could be a good place for a branding sign that don't really reflect the prohibition on monument signs throughout the county. The second part of this is what when we hear all the time, which is that many of our older buildings have a comprehensive sign plan, and those are different. Those provide different opportunities than the current Article 13. And we get asked all the time of, can I mix and match? Can I take part of my CSP and part of the Article 13 and create the right sign pack for my building? The answer today is no. And so we really want to look into how we resolve, how we deal with existing comprehensive sign plans relative to Article 13 in the sign ordinance. So with that said, I will leave it open for questions and comments.
All right, everybody's favorite subject, signs. So, Mr. DeFerranti, you want to start?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've worked on sign ordinances in a previous life as an attorney, and sign ordinances and lengthy discussions seem synonymous. Fully supportive of the flexibility to pursuing this, eager to be problem solving as we do this work, beyond necessarily, I fully agree with, the last point you made about flexibility with respect to pieces of the ordinance to loosen regulation is where I am, and I don't think I think you're strategically right for a full rewrite and extensive process. It doesn't seem like it would get us the furthest. So full support. I'm quite mindful that commentators will have concerns and worry about this as with some of the other items, but focusing on the worry won't lead us to fixing this major structural office problem. So full support.
So I know it's preliminary, but as we think about this work stream, I'm reminded, and our attorney has spoken to board members about marrying the whole idea of, the sign ordinance and laws concerning speech and not being able to regulate speech. But you referenced Fairfax County, other places that have done this seemingly with good success and no drama. I assume that we're going to avail ourselves of learning what they've done to protect themselves against these multimedia screens being used for odious purposes.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll certainly, as with all our work streams, be checking in with our other jurisdictions, neighboring jurisdictions, to find out best practices. One of the things we always remind people is but by far the landlords don't have a desire to have obnoxious speech on the side of their building. So it's the market kind of solves the problem for the most part, but obviously there's always that sort of outlier. So we'll look into how other jurisdictions have dealt with that.
Thank you. Ms. Garvey.
Yeah, I'm glad we're doing this work. I think I'm the only one who was here for the first sign ordinance discussion, and I do feel I've talked about signs as much as I would like to. I'm sure I may have more good discussions, but at the moment, I'm just fine with it. Thank you.
Ms. Garvey, you may have been the only one on the board, but as those who are all in the community, we remember it well and still have PTSD from it. All right, Mr. Karantonis.
I am one of those who has PTSD from this. On where I live, it was almost impossible to have a sandwich board out on the sidewalk. I agree with Mr. DeFerranti and really align with the desire to reasonably make it more flexible and respond to modern and current ideas about how signs contribute not only to the branding of the businesses but also to placemaking, etc. The example that Mr. Macaulay brought, which is the big screen in Mosaic, one has to see that how many people are gathering around in that public area there. This is one of the most successful implementation of such a big screen, and I think that nobody has any nefarious, intentions there, and I think that we should be able to take a little bit more risk and make it possible for this kind of creative signage to to be viable again.
Okay. All right. Yay, parking.
So another favorite topic, parking. So one of the things that we've recognized as we've been working with businesses, both big and small, is that, again, our parking regulations, while well-intentioned, often have some anomalies in them that are difficult to administratively move around. And that second, a lot of our changes in parkings related to site plans, as Ms. Hunger referenced earlier, coming back to the board to remove 5 parking spaces just is really not a great use of staff or county board time, and is not at all obviously controversial. I will say that this work stream is not envisioning a rethinking of parking policy. Obviously, we are our DES transportation team is leading this effort, but I think our parking policy is in good shape. I think this is about how we make sure our parking policies are reflected in our ordinance, and potential work stream outcomes. One of the things that we often have a challenge with is smaller or legacy sites where a change in use happens, and that use parking requirement in the zoning ordinance is what I would call significantly outdated relative to how people live and work in Arlington, and the availability of mass transit and other modes of travel. And a small business just has months and months and months of uncertainty trying to figure out how they're going to move into their space. We also know that we'd like to at least look at things like shared and off-site parking to solve that problem. An example is on some buildings on Columbia Pike have a hard time parking their own site, but they may be across the street from a public garage where any customer would have no problem parking in that garage and walking across the street. But right now in our zoning ordinance, that's a little bit of a challenge. And then a big sub-work stream item that we'll be working with DES on is when we have older site plans that were overparked. Many of our older site plans were parked at 1 per 580 square feet, where our newer site plans are much closer to 1 per 1,000 in most of our neighborhoods. When we identify unused parking, how do we create an easy path to translate that into gross floor area or usable area for things like storage, or we talked about micro fulfillment, things like that. And once again, providing an easy as possible path that doesn't have a tremendous impact on the surrounding community. In fact, probably has a positive impact in that the parking supply is not oversupplied. So with that said, open up for discussion.
Thank you. I'll start us off. So I appreciate the work to figure out how our zoning ordinance can get out of the way in those circumstances where the parking is proximate but can't be counted. But looking more to the private sector side, I've heard, because that circumstance that you described exists all over the county. In Clarendon, banks that are closed at 5, but nonetheless, that parking is not available for people who are visiting in the evenings. And some of the things that I've heard are, it's liability issues and the reasons why, parking is prohibited in those places and why we have such an advanced, no pun intended, market for advanced towing to tow cars from those lots, even though the business that the parking lot is attached to has no use for them. So do we envision having any real breakthroughs in getting the private sector to play along with this? Because I could see us doing this work, but not really having the opportunity to realize the benefits of it because people want to keep their parking for themselves, even if they're not using it.
That's a great point and great guidance, and we can certainly look into that. I think, how you create the incentive structure for that to happen. Obviously, in a lot of our site plans, we already have built-in conditions that require buildings to be open to the public, our commercial buildings, but we can certainly look into that.
Thank you. Okay. Nobody has a comment on parking. I'm going to take that. Oh, Mr. DeFranco.
Sorry, Mr. Chair. I support us having this as a strategy. I'm mindful that parking has been a big source of discussion, and I do think we need to be strategic on this item, but I support us putting it on the table and the way you described it as well. Thanks.
Great.
If I could just add one point, this isn't just about reducing the number of parking spaces, it's also, in certain cases, it makes sense to increase the availability. People need to keep that in mind, especially, we've had some people come to us about building conversions, converting from commercial to residential space, and they say, well, our building will have all these empty parking spaces. What should we do with them? And we've said, well, maybe the community nearby, flipping the script a little bit, when the community nearby gets concerned they don't have parking, maybe it's a place for the community nearby to use for parking. So that, stretching that in that direction too, I think would be useful.
Yeah, I'm always struck when I go to a Nats game, for example, and the enterprising people, much smaller and different scale, but who can make 35, 70 bucks an evening because they take their 2 spaces and make them available for private use. So feels like it can be done. All right. With that, is there anything more?
We're going to move on to the, I think it's the penultimate slide. Is it?
Yeah, there's some next step slides.
Next step slide, yeah.
So while we're calling these additional related efforts, they'll act very much like work streams, but are sort of focused on just tying some pieces together. So first, our Economic Development Commission has been working hard over the summer on recommendations from their team about how to deal with office vacancy and valuation issues. They reported in September and voted this morning, and the board will be seeing those recommendations, I'm sure shortly, if you haven't already. Those recommendations, while staff certainly monitored and supported those conversations, those have not been analyzed yet, but we're certainly going to consider them and fit them in appropriate work streams, depending on sort of how far we get with those. A lot of those include things like financial incentives, which I think it's important to note, which I think you've gotten the flavor of, is that our primary focus has been on regulatory change. Financial incentives require a lot deeper dive into what the cost benefit of those incentives are. Many communities across the country in North America have put in very aggressive incentives to do, say, building conversions. And the reality is that most people that have looked at those said they don't pencil. The benefit of those conversions is not worth the money being spent. And the purpose here is to increase our revenue, not to decrease it. So we'll look at those very carefully as part of this process. We also are very mindful of some of the questions we've heard already about, well, if there's a bunch of new residential, what is that going to do to our demographics and fiscal impact? And we have a fiscal impact model that we'll be rolling out this year. And we'll be looking at demographics with Jill's team and being able to answer the question of, let's not be unintentional about if we increase a lot more residential, what's the impact on schools and services and all those other things, and parks and libraries. And then I'll let Mark weigh in on this as well, but I think obviously this is going to be leading into a discussion later this year into early next about what the impacts on the next few budget years are going to be. And this will be tied into that discussion.
If I could just add on the budget point, we will be briefing the community in November when we come to you for closeout with economic projections. And it's safe to say that with the values in the commercial office market really dropping significantly, you're going to see budget impacts on that. I did want to note, and I think it may have been you, Mr. Dorsey, I'm not exactly sure which board member talked about it, which is that I still believe firmly we have, I'll just say, good bones as a community in our development process. We're not looking to re-envision sort of the way our community looks to any great extent, but we need to get through. Economics has a funny way of working things out. It happened back in 2008, 2009, 2010. I think this is a little bit more dire, but it will work out. And when we get to the other side, probably 3 or 4 years from now, we will be hopefully over this hump and made those kinds of adjustments. But in the meantime, there will be budget impacts. There's just no getting around it. And so that is another driver for doing these efforts. And I think when people are involved in the budget process, as we do over the upcoming spring and also in our CIP plans, people will be a little bit frustrated, I think, that we don't have the kind of flexibility we're used to. So we're trying to create flexibility on the regulatory side to try to keep that budget flexibility in place. So with that, I think we're going to go to next steps in the timeline. I know that Ms. Talenta, you had asked about that, so we waited till the very end to answer your question.
Sure. So again, this slide is really sort of a broad picture of what we're looking at over these next couple of months through the end of the year and then into next year. And the idea is sort of during the September, October, and then October through December, having some discrete conversations and presentations to some of our commissions, including our Economic Development Commission, our Planning Commission, and other commissions as appropriate, having conversations with various stakeholder groups to, again, obtain feedback and more to get information of what helps to move this needle that we're trying to move as it relates to sort of this office supply. Throughout this process will be sort of this education and communications process to our broader community. I think you're going to be seeing it not only in this, but as the manager pointed out, in budget conversations as well. So there'll be a broad education and communications process. During this time period, again, Ms. Talente, as you pointed out, we'll be doing that work stream scoping, the due diligence, and I think the prioritization. So I think, as it's been highlighted, many of these work streams will require some additional research. And as Mr. Dorsey pointed out, some could be sticky. And that may undoubtedly require shifting priorities and timelines as we bring these forward. I think all in all, the idea associated with this is that incremental approach. So rather than bringing a full package to you of everything wrapped up together, you'll be seeing, similar to what we did in the CMRI 1.0, every other month or every 2 months or so, concepts coming to you as that initial request to advertise. And then we'll go out to that broader engagement strategy that we outlined before. So I think you'll start seeing a pattern and a rhythm. But again, I think what we want to do with that is keep the momentum going and recognizing that we're doing this sort of not as one big package, but incremental pieces to address these concerns and the challenges that we are facing as a community. So, again, I think early in 24, you'll be seeing that initial 1 or 2 coming forward to you. And looking forward to that. And I think with that,
There was one last slide, which if we could go to.
Concluding remarks, yeah.
Well, so if,
No, sorry.
we'd like you just to sign on the dotted line and say everything we're going to do is perfect. But beside that, I think I'm hearing from all of you that you're encouraging us to go down this path, but to keep our eyes wide open as to how the community is going to react, and we will do that. And again, I want to emphasize, we were not specific intentionally about what the solutions might be, the specific solutions in each case. But we welcome your input, and I know we'll hear from a lot of people. And I did want to emphasize, we will be, as Jill said, talking a lot to the community. We're going to the NAOP meeting tomorrow. We're talking to the Planning Commission, and I'm starting a series of conversations along with the Civic Federation on Thursday night, where I'm meeting with Civic Association presidents, and this will be top of mind. So with that, back to you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And this is a good way for us to recap, make sure that there are no thoughts that have been left on the table by board members. I think we've gone through, and just by my read, I have been keeping score for those at home. We've all, I think, accepted the urgency of the time that we're in and endorsed this as an overall approach and focus from all of the various individuals and their respective teams. And the incremental approach also seems like it carries favor, so as not to get stuck with trying to do something comprehensive, but to be nimble and to bring things as they are ready and as the calendar makes appropriate. yeah, you probably miss stuff, but this is a big bite that you're taking off. So at least from my perspective, there's nothing I'm gonna add to your plate. This seems like a useful body of work. And the broader community awareness campaign, obviously, it's going to be necessary. It's going to challenge us in ways that we haven't been challenged before, but it seems like you're going into it with eyes wide open. Mr. DeFerranti.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Three thoughts. First, as we were thinking through the full body of work, I kept coming back to site plans that we've seen, and the community doesn't remember site plans that are nearly without controversy. You remember the site plan near you that was with controversy, but over the last year or 2 years, there have been a lot of site plans that have been relatively, substantively, ultimately not very controversial. So those who are thinking about transparency and process might think about, our housing discussion last year, and then contrast that with site plans. This is about site plans. And so I think that's an important point for our community, the few folks who are listening, also those who are communicating about this. This is distinct from that in the large part. Site plans, relatively, let's move on that. Two phrases stick out. We need to be ready to take big swings and act with urgency and a rapid progression of the work. And I just think that's worth repeating. It was on one of the slides, and it's worth making sure people hear. And last, I think of good to great. The world has fundamentally changed. So over the last 2 hours, we don't want to talk ourselves out of knowing that fact. The world has fundamentally changed. And so the question is, how smart is Arlington going to be about recognizing the facts, difficult as they may be, and then thinking differently and quickly? And if you think of our history and the huge growth around the time of the Pentagon, transit-oriented development, the decision we made on Amazon, I'm confident that we will think differently quickly, but we have to in order to thrive and grow our economy. So those are three thoughts. Thanks, Mr. Chair and colleagues.
Thank you. Mr. Karantonis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I want to thank Ms. McCauley, Ms. Hunger, and the entire team of at the AD, at Arlington Economic Development, and Mr. Fusarelli's team for having been, have been very proactive until now on this. They have been thinking ahead. They have tried to delineate a pathway through really difficult questions. And I really am very grateful for this. And I've learned a lot in the interaction with them and other stakeholders who have been involved in thinking ahead. That includes also our commission and commercial stakeholders whom I've been talking about the challenges ahead. To add to Mr. DeFerranti's narrative here, I see two things. First of all, I see also enormous opportunity in the way we think right now. We are not just responding to a challenge, we are trying to make the absolute best out of that, making resources, allocating resources in a better way, more efficient way, more profitable way at the end. We are supporting the creation of many jobs eventually if we get if we get it right and we can position buildings again in a way that is more responsive to the current markets and creates the economic activity that we envision can be created there if we can adapt timely to the necessities of this market. There's one thing that I want to reiterate, because in the past, it wasn't always easy to work on this. And this is involving and talking to small businesses, startups, the creative sector, to the many new players that are there, but until now have had a tough time to, not always a tough time, but they needed support to be present and thrive in Arlington. I think we have many success stories on how we have engaged them creatively and how we have gotten them to use the resources that are available in our market in a more efficient, creative, and spirited way than maybe the bigger tenants. There's no question that the bigger tenants are the bigger asset holders are the proverbial elephants in the room, but there is a lot of potential in the small business area. And I just encourage everybody to really lean into this and look and talk to our small entrepreneurial ecosystem, which I believe is thriving and extremely promising. So with this, I thank you for this work session. It's been very insightful for me. Look forward to continuing the process.
Thank you. And Ms. Talento?
Thank you, Chair Dorsey. I did just want to answer, when you say anything we missed, I can't think of anything, but I noted that in one of the slides you said these are our initial work streams. So I'm assuming with that, if you hear something coming up over and over again, that there may be an added work stream. And I just wanted to confirm that because of the due diligence that you're looking to do.
Yes, absolutely. And also, I'll say that the work streams are, we talked about at a high level.
Yeah.
There's multiple components to the work streams, and we're going to prioritize them by which ones, as we talked about earlier, can get done quicker, are more impactful. And absolutely, this is not we're writing this down on stone tablets, and this is the work plan. We're going to continue to adapt as we see new opportunities.
Excellent. And so with that, I just wanted to, I appreciated what Mr. DeFronte said about noting, like taking big swings in urgency, rapid progression of work. And I really feel strongly about community education because I had the unique opportunity to serve on the community facility study. And as a schools advocate at the time, I learned so much about just how my everyday life is impacted by what we do in the county. And one thing that I don't think many of our community members know is the value of the 50/50 commercial tax base. And so, everyone at this table who's presenting to us are planners, and planners address crisis with planning and action plans and creating a plan to address. So I'm a planner, so a lot of times you don't show like we're panicking because we're going to make a plan to address it. But I think we need to really share with the community, whether it's through data, that this is a crisis, this is not good. With Arlington being so small, there's a beauty that we can do so much. But when there's change, we're also more impacted, I think, than bigger counties. So Fairfax County, I think, if I remember correctly, has like a 70%, 30%, or was, right? So 70% was residential taxes, right? 30% was commercial. Well, that's, if they have some vacancy, their residents may not really feel it as much as we do with the 50/50. And so as you start out with your community engagement, like, while you're not going to show your urgency in your calm voice and planned, processes, show them through the data, right? Show them that we're one of the only with this small tax base and how lucky we are and how this is urgent because this is going to have significant impacts on services, as you mentioned, Mr. Schwartz, over the next few years, a budget impact. Like, what are we going to have to cut, right? When we had to cut in schools, it was very stressful. And I don't think we've had to, experience that as much at the county level. But if we don't get this right very quickly, it's going to really impact us. And it's going to impact our community members in their tax rates, et cetera. So I would just ask you to show your sense of urgency through your data, because I know you won't be able to do it, through your presentation, because you're planners and you're making a plan to fix it. And I appreciate what you've done today. I support all the work that you put forward, and I don't have any discussions, just asking you to consider that as you move out. And thank you for the time in the work session.
Thank you. Ms. Garvey, you'll have the last word.
Oh, fine. Thank you. I just want to thank everybody. It's hard to imagine that you all might have forgotten something, but if you have, I'm sure we'll hear about it. So thank you for the flexibility on that. I appreciate Ms. Talento's comments on planning, and we are planning, and we address crises with planning, but of course we know we have to actually do things as well. We can't just keep planning, we got to implement. And I appreciate the sense of urgency, and I'm looking forward to being able to implement some of this, the low-hanging fruit, ASAP. And we'll be moving on that. I know the manager will be as well. So thanks much for the work and appreciate your time and all the effort and look forward to lots of interesting discussions coming up. Thank you.
All right. In the spirit of being nimble, we're going to give you 7 extra minutes to get to work. We are hereby adjourned. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you all for the time.
Thanks, everybody. Take care. Takas, have a good trip.
Thanks.